Thanks for downloading this episode of TheWhyFactor on the BBC World Service. In this edition, why do we see people as outsiders?
It was February 2013. It was really cold and my sister had asked me to come over and help her with her uni assignments, and we stayed up most of the night doing that.
This is Euen Herbert Small.
Early in the morning there was a knock at the door, and I got up and I looked out the window from upstairs and I can see what appears to be police, about 5-6 of them.
He's 38 years old. He was born on the island of St. Kitts and Nevis in the Caribbean.
So I went back to bed because, I don't have any problems with the police and I wasn't too bothered.
He's a trained pilot and an IT engineer.
But apparently they were UK border agents and they kept banging down the door, and I got up. And just as I was coming down the stairs, I saw the lock fall out of the door. And they came in screaming, "Immigration, immigration."
Euen has lived in the UK since 2003. For all that time, he felt that he belonged in Britain. The state took a different view.
I was just in t-shirt and long johns and socks, and I jumped out the back window onto the shed, by which time there was a female agent in the back garden, and she'd extended her baton and she was like, "Freeze," or whatever she said. I just jumped a few fences. I was hiding in one of the neighbors' gardens because I didn't want to be embarrassed. Immigration coming and taking me from the house on a Sunday morning. And then the dog finally came under the bushes and found me, and they grabbed me and pulled me out. Then they put me in the vehicle and brought me back around to where I was living on the other street. And what really upset me is that they brought my clothes, they let me get dressed in the vehicle, and then they took me out of the vehicle to search me in front of my neighbors.
The incident ended with Euen in a detention centre, and not for the first time. Euen is part of the Windrush cohort, immigrants whose claims to residency in the United Kingdom originate from parents, or in Ewen's case grandparents, from Caribbean Commonwealth nations. The group is named for one of the ships which brought them to Britain to help rebuild the country after World War II. In 2010, the UK government made a pledge to reduce the number of immigrants annually entering the country. 2 years later, the then Home Secretary, now Prime Minister, Theresa May, said, "The aim is to create here in Britain a really hostile environment for illegal migration." The word hostile in this context meant a policy which aimed to deny people without the right documents access to work, healthcare, and other basic necessities, and challenged their right to remain in the country. People like Euen got caught up in the new bureaucracy. What does being an immigrant feel like to you?
For me, it feels like a misnomer. It's just a perception of the mind. I don't consider myself as an immigrant at all. But I have been called one, and so it feels like a harsh word to describe someone as. It feels like you've been given an unwanted status, and an unwelcoming one as well.
Who do we welcome into our lives, and who is deemed an outsider?
Humans very reliably divide the world up into us and them.
And one of the most obvious outsiders is the foreigner, the stranger in a strange land. And lately the outlook towards these immigrants has been hardening.
There's layers on top of this. There's the us versus them lens, and then there's the question of what kind of them are we talking about?
Once you start looking at someone else as the other, a possible threat, how do you diffuse that?
Well, that's a really difficult question. That's one that psychology and humanity has been grappling with for thousands of years.
This is TheWhyFactor on the BBC World Service. I'm Sandra Canthal. In today's programme, why is it we divide the world into us and them? How quickly do we make these judgments about who is one of us and who is one of them?
We can do it very quickly indeed. It's not a delusion to see people as us and them. It corresponds to the nature of our social experience.
Stephen Reicher is a professor of psychology at the University of St Andrews in Scotland.
We're divided by gender sometimes. We're divided by nation sometimes. We're divided by race sometimes. So we become very adept at doing it. If we want our identities to be defined positively, which by default, of course, we do, then the only way we can achieve that is by making the in-group, our group, seem better than the out-group. But what that means in practice, and what it means for how we behave, is very much a matter of the ways in which the meanings, the norms, the values of different groups are defined in our culture.
And at the moment, cultures are colliding all over the world. According to a 2017 United Nations report, more than 250 million of us do not live in the country of our birth. That's an increase of almost 50% since the year 2000.
I was actually born in the UK, but my upbringing was predominantly in India, and I've been moving around the world for most of my life.
Satbir Singh is the chief executive of the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants, a charity in the UK. He's making use of his experience as an outsider. Here in your office, in a bookshelf over your head, there's two baseball caps. One says good immigrant and one says bad immigrant. What's the difference? Which cap do you ask people to wear?
Well, we believe that everybody is both. And the challenge with being an immigrant, first generation, second generation, seeker of asylum or otherwise, is you are typically weighed and measured against very different standards to pretty much everybody else in society. A lot of the time when we're talking about the need for being more accepting of migrants or the need to be tolerant towards different communities, we will point inevitably to economic contributions, to fantastic achievements. So in the UK, a lot of the discourse around migration is often rebuffed with, well, you know, look at Mo Farah, who's won 8 gold medals at the Olympics and the international athletics competitions.
Into the last 30 metres, Mo Farah breaks the world record!
That's an intolerably high bar to set for everybody else, because when you pin that up as the goal to which migrants must aspire in order to be acceptable, you're setting us all up to fail.
One of the ways people are made to feel like outsiders is through the language used to describe them. Recently, words like swarm, infest, animals, and vermin have crept into national conversations about immigration. Terms like these resonate, and they stick.
The activation of these negative stereotypes has a lot of consequences.
Meena Chikara is a professor of psychology at Harvard University in the USA.
The first is that if you've never thought about the other, it suddenly makes them salient, and makes them salient in a particular way, i.e. as a threat. The second thing it does is that it activates the accessibility of that stereotype. So let's say you were at a Donald Trump rally, and you didn't have particularly positive or negative stereotypes about Mexicans prior to the rally, but now that you've heard that they're all rapists and murderers, according to him, now you have a very negative stereotype about them. And the problem is that the more and more you hear that messaging, the more and more accessible that representation becomes, the more likely you are to activate murder when you hear Mexican immigrants, as opposed to any other kind of representation. And the problem with that is that the more accessible these constructs become, the more common they appear to us. This is a basic consequence of something called the accessibility bias. And that has to be devastating, because we know that one of the most important things for human survival is a sense of belonging to your community, being able to trust your neighbor. And the second you understand that everybody's looking at you with suspicion, or that you are no longer a part of that community, it is extremely devastating to one's psychology and well-being.
The notion of they can become weaponized. It can become politicized. It can be turned into something whereby we see them as a danger, as a threat, and so on. Because the notion of an immigrant tells us that this person is other to us. They come from elsewhere. Now, I think it's not insignificant that when you look at the major categories of people who have been pathologized in the era of nation states, they are people who are defined as not having a place, as being itinerant. The Roma, Gypsy, the wandering Jew, and now the immigrant. So the very description of somebody as an immigrant is immediately saying they are an outsider. And it's not surprising then that a lot of people respond in negative terms. It's not a question of psychology, it's a question of culture, it's a question of politics. Very often it's a question of political leadership.
As it happened, while I was making this programme, Ewen was making another attempt to become a UK citizen. What's happening today?
We're in East Croydon today. I'm here for an appointment with the Home Office to sort out my British citizenship. I really don't know what to expect, but I anticipate that I should be acknowledged as a British citizen today. So it's 12:30. I've arrived early for my 1 o'clock appointment. So we'll go in and see what happens, and we'll update you after.
Several decades ago, psychologists developed social identity theory to better understand the ways people make sense of their place in the world through the groups that they belong to. One of the founders of this theory was a Polish immigrant to the UK, Henri Tarfel, and one of his students was Stephen Reicher.
The reason why identities are so important is that they provide a framework which allows us to act in the world. We have done research to show that we are more likely to help in-group members than out-group members. But given that our identities change, so who we help depends on how we define ourselves. So we have found, for instance, that when people who are Manchester United fans define themselves as Manchester United fans, they help Manchester United fans, they ignore Liverpool fans. On the other hand, when you take the self-same people, you make salient their identity as football fans, now the identity is more inclusive, so they help people who are Manchester United fans, and they help people who are Liverpool fans, because they're both football fans. They still ignore people who are non-football fans. So the way we define our identities in the way that includes or excludes incomers is absolutely critical to whether we show them the forms of everyday support which are critical to people feeling welcomed and people feeling part of the community.
People can be swayed by what they see or what they think they see. In a recent survey in Italy, where the newly elected populist government came to power on an anti-immigration platform, people believe that nearly 25% of the country's population was made up of immigrants. The actual number is 7%. In countries across Europe, the numbers vary, but the pattern is constant. Where we come from is a fundamental part of who we are, but we all have many layers to our identities. Our race, religion, nationality, even the food or music we like. They are numerous and elastic. As Professor Reicher pointed out, we are more likely to help people who we feel belong to our group, like the football supporters he described. And that can sometimes force us to make difficult decisions.
Ja, es war natürlich da vor 2,5 Jahren ein Riesenchaos hier in Essen.
2.5 years ago, that was of course a giant chaos here in Essen. You can't imagine how many thousands of refugees arrived here in Essen.
Jörg Sarter runs the Essener Tafel in the German city of Essen. It's a local branch of a national charity which distributes food to those in need. Last year, he noticed that some of his regular customers had stopped coming to his centre. Women especially had become intimidated by the number of new, often male immigrants and the way they behaved in the queues. For this reason, amongst others, Jörg decided to take a controversial step.
Ja, wir haben dann entschieden, dass wir vorübergehend
We decided that temporarily, for a certain period of time, we would not take on any additional foreign citizen. We did continue supplying those foreign citizens with food who had an eligibility card. We simply didn't take on any new ones.
Jörg felt he had to prioritise his existing customers over the new arrivals.
wir hatten immer so einen Ausländeranteil von ungefähr 35%.
We always had a percentage of foreigners of about 35%. In the last 3 years, it has risen to 75%. Where we had to draw the line, if you get off on the tram stop in the morning and you want to queue for us, and there are already 50 Arabic men, then you would not join the queue as an elderly woman. It's as simple as that. If someone says something different, he lives in an ivory tower, because they simply don't feel comfortable. There we said, no, not that way.
Initially, the response to the decision was hostile. Some detractors went as far as to graffiti the word Nazi on his delivery vans. But Jorg was adamant this was not a decision to exclude foreigners. With limited resources, he chose to focus on the members he already had. But the controversy highlighted the strains of integrating different groups in a community. The ban, he explained, would only last until they could restore the balance between Germans and everyone else.
Wir haben dann nach 4 Monaten
After 4 months, we achieved the balance again, that we have roughly 50% German and 50% non-Germans.
Jorg says things run much more smoothly now, and he no longer needs to turn foreign applicants away. Newcomers have learned to adjust to local customs, and he says his German customers have become more understanding of the migrants.
Also diese Entscheidung der Essener Tafel finde ich heute noch richtig.
So, the decision of the Essener Tafel I still find right, and I would, if I were in the same situation, take the same decision.
The very idea of integration is different in different parts of the world.
Japan is an island, meaning in Japanese, 日本は島国だから.
In 2017, Japan had nearly 20,000 applications for asylum. It accepted 20.
When people use this word, we have this consensus. Because we are an island, we never merge with different countries. We do not allow or we do not accept or we cannot merge with different culture.
In Japan, less than 2% of the population are foreign-born. The country has so few immigrants, experts worry that the workforce will become dangerously depleted as the country rapidly ages.
When I tell these phrases to my friend and say Japan is an island, and then let's say British friend, Australian friend would say, so what? We are all island and we grow our country with the immigrants.
Misa Matsusaki is the founder of Work Japan, a platform to help blue-collar workers navigate the Japanese job market, a complicated system of work permits distributed by a government which doesn't even like to use the word immigration in an official capacity.
Government always, when they discuss these foreign visa things, they always say, this is not immigration, okay? Because we have a lot of opponent parties, opponent peoples, publics, who are against having the outsiders to live in our country.
Misa is trying to change these deeply ingrained cultural norms, though it seems likely to be a slow process.
What I see in my client, at the very beginning, they're skeptical. But they start to have one foreigners working in their office, working in their stores, and then start to feel, okay, they're not so bad. Maybe they are from a different culture, they have different skin colors, but they're not so bad. And then they try the second one, and then they go up to 3, and then they start to think, okay, why don't we promote them and let them become a store manager or the leader?
Misa has also been an immigrant herself. She spent her childhood in South Africa, and she believes strongly in the need for Japanese society to open up to outsiders. And her influence is being felt close to home.
My husband is completely Japanese. So I thought if he never get married to me, he would never think of hiring foreigners in his team. But he saw what I was doing, and then he decided maybe we can utilize the power of foreign engineers.
And Mark Cinco is one of those engineers. He emigrated to Japan from the Philippines. And while he's mostly positive about the move, it hasn't been without its challenges.
It's harder for foreigners because there's this thing that a friend of mine told me. There's a soto naka thing. In Japanese, soto is like outside, the naka is like inside. So it's harder for us foreigners to friendship or closeness with the Japanese.
And there are practical problems too.
There was this time when me and my friend were looking for a house. Then this friend of mine was half Japanese, half Filipino. And when the landlord found out that there's going to be a foreigner living in his apartment, the landlord instantly declined or refused to acknowledge our application. Even though we're very clean people, we're not noisy, and we can pay. But just because of me being a foreigner.
If you had other friends from the Philippines who were thinking of moving to Japan, what would you tell them? Would you recommend it, or would you say you may want to think about this a bit more?
I would recommend it to them because Living here, despite the language barrier, really is fun because us Filipinos, we enjoy good food and Japan has good food.
Dividing people up into the groups we do and don't belong to helps us to establish our place in the world. Throughout history, people have treated outsiders with suspicion, and welcoming people into our lives who do not look and sound like us can be an alarming proposition. But seeking a better life is part of the human condition, and it's one that is unlikely ever to change.
It's inevitable. People have always moved and they will always move. We need to detoxify our conversation around it. We are living through a period of prolonged and deepening insecurities. Humans faced with those sorts of insecurities typically need a villain. We can't necessarily see the changing of the climate. We can't point to the economy because it doesn't have an address. But we can see the arrival of people who look different and sound different into our neighborhoods. People have bonds of love, of family. People will be married, people will have children, people will move to flee conflict. Movement of people is inevitable. Only when we accept that can we start to move forward.
So I've just come out from the Home Office and gotten no satisfaction today. The letter that I have here says that they're considering my case under the Windrush scheme. I'm just not happy at all about it. I'm quite distraught.
What does that mean your status is now?
Well, it's still undetermined. I don't have a status to walk away with.
So what do you do now?
I have no idea what I'm going to do now, to be honest with you. It's just basically wait and see what they decide.
Are you going to stay here or are you going to go back to St. Kitts?
I'm definitely going to stay in the United Kingdom. My children are here. I can't abandon them. I can't just walk away from them. So I have to stay and do whatever it takes. If I got to fight, reapply, if I got to challenge a decision, whatever it takes, I have to do it.
You've been listening to The WhyFactor on the BBC World Service. I'm Sandra Canthal. This program was mixed by Tom Brignall and the editor is Andrew Smith. You can hear more programs on topics which might interest you, such as the refugee's journey or family names. You can find them at bbc.com/whyfactor. Migration in all its many forms isn't going to stop.
The data doesn't suggest that it is, yeah. What I think the greater problem is for us to tackle is how do we get people secure enough in their own systems so that just the presence of other people doesn't immediately trigger this kind of a threat response. That's a much harder problem to solve, and if I had the answer to that, I'd probably have won the Nobel Prize by now.